The first gunshot echoed through the warehouse before the kidnapper could finish his sentence. He was still smiling when it happened, still confident, still in control. 1 second earlier, he had been leaning against a metal table, explaining the rules like a man who believed he owned the situation. The next, his body slammed backward, crashing into stacked crates before collapsing onto the concrete floor. Silence followed. Thick. Heavy. Final. I didn't freeze. I didn't panic, and I didn't question myself. Because the moment someone takes your child, hesitation becomes a luxury you can't afford. The others stared at me in shock, their brains struggling to catch up with reality. They had expected a desperate businessman, a man willing to beg, a man who would negotiate. They were wrong. I raised the weapon again, my breathing slow, controlled, exactly how I had practiced it thousands of times before. This wasn't rage. This was execution of a plan that had been forming since the moment my phone rang. And as the echo of the shot faded, one thought burned through my mind with absolute clarity. I am bringing my daughter home. To the world, I was known as Daniel Harper, founder, CEO, self-made entrepreneur. My days were filled with board meetings, financial forecasts, and polite smiles exchanged across glass conference tables. People described me as calm, analytical, predictable, the kind of man who avoided conflict and solved problems with logic instead of force. They saw the suit. They never saw what existed underneath it. Every morning, long before my office lights turned on, I woke up at 5:30. Not because I had to, but because discipline doesn't negotiate with comfort. 30 miles outside the city, hidden behind a rusted iron gate and surrounded by dead trees, was a private shooting range few people even knew existed. No signs, no advertisements, just a concrete structure swallowed by silence. That was where I went. 3, sometimes 4 times a week. I trained alone. No competitions, no socializing, no witnesses. Just repetition, grip, stance, breathing, trigger control. I didn't train to feel powerful. I trained to feel prepared. Years earlier, before success, before money, before the life people envied, I had failed to protect someone I loved. The details were buried deep, a closed chapter I never spoke about, but the lesson stayed with me. Never be helpless again. That promise became a routine, and that routine became part of who I was. Emily knew nothing about it. She only knew her father as the man who packed her lunch every morning, attended school plays, and reminded her to text when she arrived somewhere safely. She laughed easily, trusted completely, and believed the world was kinder than it really was. I wanted it to stay that way, but the world doesn't ask permission before showing its teeth. The call came on an ordinary afternoon, 3:17 p.m. I remember because I glanced at my watch, annoyed by the interruption. I almost let it go to voicemail, almost. The voice on the other end was calm, too calm. "We have your daughter." At first, the words felt disconnected, like they belonged to another conversation, another life. I even opened my mouth to correct him. Then he described her jacket. Pink, a small tear near the left sleeve. The same one she had worn that morning. My vision blurred. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten emotionally. He spoke like a man ordering coffee. "You call the police, she dies." No explanation, no drama, just a rule. They gave me an amount of money so high it made my stomach drop. Then they gave me a deadline. And finally, they hung up. I stood frozen in my office long after the call ended, the city humming beneath me, completely unaware that my world had just ended. In that moment, I understood something most people never do. This wasn't about money. It never was. And whatever happened next would not be resolved by playing by the rules. I didn't leave the office that night. I sat alone in the dark, the city lights reflecting against the glass walls, replaying the call over and over in my head. Every word, every pause, every breath on the other end of the line. I told myself to stay calm. Panic wouldn't help Emily. Emotion wouldn't bring her back. Only decisions would. I opened my laptop and began pulling up numbers, accounts, assets, investments, lines of credit. I had money, more than most people would ever see, Mo, but not in the way kidnappers imagine. My wealth was tied up in structures, properties, long-term positions. Liquidating everything fast enough would be impossible. And even if I somehow managed it, a deeper truth kept pushing its way to the surface. Men who kidnap children don't plan to stop once the money arrives. I'd seen enough in my life to know that criminals who threaten a child's life over the phone rarely keep their promises. The payment wasn't an ending. It was leverage, a delay, a way to stay in control. Emily wasn't a bargaining chip. She was a liability. And once I admitted that to myself, the illusion of choice disappeared. I wasn't deciding whether to act. I was deciding how. I drove home just before dawn. The house felt wrong the moment I stepped inside. Too quiet. Too empty. Her shoes were still by the door. Her backpack sat on the chair where she'd dropped it the day before. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the details, committing them to memory like I was afraid they might vanish too. Then I went to the locked room. It wasn't hidden behind secret panels or false walls. It was simply a room no one ever questioned. A storage space I'd converted years earlier, long before Emily was born. Inside, everything was exactly where it should be. I opened the safe. The weight of the metal door felt familiar in my hands. One by one, I laid the equipment out on the table, not rushed, not emotional. Every movement deliberate. Firearms cleaned and maintained weekly. Ammunition sorted by caliber. Suppressors sealed. Gloves, maps, burner phones. This wasn't a fantasy. This was preparation meeting purpose. I took a breath and checked my watch. The kidnappers had given me 48 hours. They thought that deadline controlled me. They were wrong. The phone rang again the next morning. Different number. Same voice. Any problems getting the money? I let silence hang for a moment, just long enough to sound desperate. I need more time, I said. He laughed softly. That's not my problem. I agreed, apologized, played the role they expected. The weak father scrambling for solutions. But while he spoke, I listened, not to his words, to the sounds behind them. A hollow echo, metal clanging in the distance, water dripping rhythmically, and traffic, faint but present, industrial zone, large space, poor insulation. When the call ended, I didn't feel relief. I felt focus. I made a few calls next. Not to the police, not to lawyers, to people who owed me favors. Men who didn't ask questions. Men who knew how to listen without speaking. Within hours, fragments of information started to align. Phone pings, old warehouse records, patterns of similar crimes that had quietly disappeared without headlines. The men who took Emily weren't professionals. They were predators who believed fear made them powerful. Predators always make the same mistake. They get comfortable. By nightfall, I had a location that made sense. Not certain, but close enough. I drove past it once, then twice. An abandoned warehouse at the edge of the industrial district. No cameras, no visible guards. One dim light flickering near a side entrance. A rusted chain hanging loose. They thought isolation meant safety. They didn't know isolation works both ways. I parked 3 blocks away and waited. Watched patterns. Counted movements. Listened. By midnight, I was sure. Emily was inside. I didn't rush in. I went home, showered, changed clothes, and sat at the kitchen table as the sun began to rise. My reflection in the window didn't look like a businessman anymore. It looked like a man who had already crossed a line, even if the world hadn't noticed yet. I sent one final message from the burner phone they had contacted me with. I'm trying. Please don't hurt her. They replied with a photo. Emily. Alive. Terrified. That was the last confirmation I needed. I picked up the weapon, checked the chamber, and for the first time since the call, I spoke out loud. "Hold on, sweetheart," I whispered to the empty room. "I'm coming." The city was asleep when I returned to the warehouse. Streetlights flickered in the distance, casting long shadows across cracked pavement and abandoned loading docks. I parked where I had before, killed the engine, and sat in silence for a full minute, letting my breathing slow until it matched the steady rhythm I'd trained into my body over years. Fear was still there, but it was contained. I moved through the shadows, every step calculated, every sound measured. The side entrance was exactly as I'd seen it earlier. The loose chain, the half-open metal door swaying slightly with the breeze. They hadn't even bothered to secure it. Inside, the air was thick with oil, dust, and rust. The echo of my footsteps disappeared as soon as I crossed the threshold. I paused, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness, scanning for movement. Voices, 2 men, laughing, relaxed. They were playing cards at a makeshift table near a stack of crates, weapons resting within arm's reach but not in their hands. One of them had his back turned. I exhaled slowly. The first shot was quiet, controlled. He dropped before his brain could register what happened. The second man looked up, confusion flashing across his face just long enough for panic to bloom. He reached for his gun. Too slow. He collapsed next to the table, cards scattering across the floor like something from a bad joke. I didn't stop moving. Stillness gets you killed. I advanced deeper into the building, staying close to the walls, listening. My pulse remained steady. Training had taken over, pushing thought aside and replacing it with instinct. Another voice echoed down a hallway to my right. Angry. Raised. A third man stepped into view, carrying a phone, his expression shifting from irritation to shock the moment he saw me. He opened his mouth. I didn't give him the chance to scream. His body slid down the wall, leaving a dark smear behind him. I checked the hallway before moving forward, clearing corners, controlling angles. The warehouse was larger than it looked from the outside, divided into sections by rusted partitions and storage rooms that hadn't been used in years. Then I heard it. A muffled sound, not a voice, a sob. My grip tightened. Emily was close. That knowledge sharpened everything. 2 more men appeared near a loading bay, alerted now, weapons raised, eyes wild. This time there was no surprise, just raw reaction. They fired. I moved. Shots ricocheted off metal, sparks flying as I dropped behind a forklift, returned fire, and repositioned before they could adjust. One went down screaming. The other tried to retreat. He didn't make it. The warehouse fell quiet again, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the ringing in my ears. I paused, forcing myself not to rush. This was where mistakes happened, where people assumed it was over. It wasn't. I followed the sound of the sobbing to a reinforced door near the back of the building. A heavy lock secured it from the outside. I didn't hesitate. The door burst open, slamming against the wall. Emily was inside, tied to a chair, hands bound. Her face streaked with tears, eyes wide with terror, and then disbelief. She stared at me like I was something unreal. "Dad?" she whispered. The sound of her voice shattered whatever was left of my composure. I dropped the weapon and crossed the room in 2 strides, cutting the restraints, pulling her into my arms before she could even stand. "I've got you," I said, my voice breaking despite my effort to control it. "You're safe." She clung to me like she was afraid I might disappear. Behind us, a noise echoed from the main warehouse. Footsteps. One of them was still alive. I turned slowly, placing Emily behind me. The man stood in the doorway, weapon shaking in his hands, eyes darting between me and the bodies scattered behind him. His confidence was gone, his voice trembled. "Please," he said. "We can talk about this." I stared at him, feeling nothing. "This was never a conversation," I replied. He dropped the gun and raised his hands, tears streaming down his face, babbling excuses, names, promises. I didn't hear them. All I saw was my daughter, shaking behind me. I fired once. Silence returned, final this time. I picked Emily up, wrapping my jacket around her shoulders. shielding her from the scene as we walked out of the warehouse together. The cool night air hit us as we crossed the threshold, and for the first time since the call, my lungs filled completely. We drove away without sirens, without witnesses, just a father and his daughter heading home. The police arrived hours later. They called it a violent dispute between criminals, a failed extortion attempt, an internal fallout. No suspects, no further questions. Emily slept in my bed that night, holding my arm like a lifeline. I didn't sleep at all. I sat awake, listening to her breathe, watching the sunrise paint the walls with light. Some lines, once crossed, can't be uncrossed, but I'd cross them all again. Because they thought they kidnapped a businessman. They never understood they had awakened something far more dangerous. Emily didn't talk about that night, not at first. Doctors said it was normal. Shock, trauma, the mind protecting itself by locking memories away until it felt safe enough to release them. I nodded, thanked them, listened carefully, the same way I always did, while knowing that some doors, once opened, never truly close again. She stayed home from school for weeks, slept with the lights on, flinched at sudden noises. Sometimes she would wake up in the middle of the night, gasping for air, calling my name before she was fully conscious. Every time I was there, I never left her side. During the day, life tried to return to normal. Emails flooded my inbox. Meetings were rescheduled. Colleagues expressed concern in polite, distant ways. The company needed me. The world expected me to keep functioning. I did, but something had shifted. I no longer mistook normal for safe. The police closed the case quickly. Too quickly. Officially, it was labeled a criminal dispute that turned violent. Unofficially, everyone understood what had happened, and no one wanted to pull on a thread that could unravel something uglier. No arrests, no press conferences, no follow-ups. I didn't ask questions, and they didn't ask me any. Weeks passed, then months. Emily slowly found her way back to herself. Her laughter returned in pieces, cautious at first, then stronger. She went back to school, started drawing again, made plans with friends. The world, in her eyes, began to soften. Mine never did. I noticed things I hadn't before. Which streets felt too quiet, which cars lingered too long, which shadows didn't belong. I adjusted, changed routines, upgraded security, stayed alert, not paranoid, prepared. One night, months later, Emily sat beside me on the couch, her legs tucked under her, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She stared at the television without really watching it. "Dad?" she said quietly. "Yes?" "Are the bad men gone?" I paused. There was no perfect answer. No lie that wouldn't eventually crack. "Yes," I said finally. "They can't hurt you anymore." She nodded, satisfied, and rested her head against my arm. A moment later, she spoke again. "You weren't scared, ma'am, were you?" I looked down at her, at the innocence still fighting to survive inside her, and felt a tightness in my chest I couldn't explain. "I was terrified," I said softly. She frowned. "Then how did you do it?" I thought about that question long after she fell asleep that night. The truth was simple. I did it because fear doesn't disappear when you become a parent. It transforms. Fear becomes fuel. Months later, I stood once again at the shooting range outside the city. Same rusted gate, same silence, same cold concrete walls. I raised the weapon, took my stance. And then, I stopped. For the first time in years, I didn't fire. I lowered the gun and stood there, breathing, listening to the quiet. Training had given me control. Preparation had saved my daughter. But love was the reason I never hesitated. I locked everything away again that day. Not because I regretted what I'd done, but because I prayed I'd never need to do it again. Some men spend their lives believing violence is power. They're wrong. Power is knowing you can end something and choosing not to. But if the day ever comes when someone threatens what you love most, when they believe fear will keep you obedient, when they mistake kindness for weakness, they should remember this. They didn't kidnap a businessman. They didn't challenge a system. They didn't outsmart the law. They woke a father. And a father with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous man alive.
So, that's the end of this story, but there are plenty of other great ones right here. Before you go, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring that little bell.